All right, today we're tackling some of the biggest questions humanity has ever asked. Seriously, we're going on a journey through the very idea of belief to understand how our answers have changed over thousands and thousands of years.
I mean, think about it. Since we first looked up at the stars, we've been asking these fundamental questions. They are the engine behind pretty much everything. Philosophy, religion, you name it. They've literally shaped the course of civilizations.
So, our goal here is to trace how these huge ideas evolved. We're going to follow them in the order they really showed up in history, not to say one is right or wrong, but just to get a handle on how our thinking has shifted across the globe.
And here's our roadmap for the journey. We'll start way back in the ancient world with theism. Then we'll jump to the 5th century BCE for the rise of non-theism, mostly in the East. After that, it's a big leap forward to the Enlightenment to talk about deism. And we'll wrap things up in the modern era with atheism.
Okay, so let's kick things off where most of human history began, with theism. You have to remember, for millennia, this wasn't just one of the answers to those big questions. For most people, it was the only answer.
So, what is theism at its core? It's the belief that there's a divine power, or maybe a bunch of them, and they aren't just some distant creators. Nope. They are actively involved in the universe and in our lives.
And it's pretty easy to see how this worldview came to be, right? Imagine you're an early human. You see a terrifying storm, or, on the flip side, the miracle of a good harvest. Without science to explain it, it's only natural to see some kind of intention behind it all, to chalk it up to some unseen forces or gods.
Now, the earliest form of theism was almost always polytheism, believing in many gods. Think about the whole lineup of gods in ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. These weren't just abstract ideas, they were seen as powerful personal beings who demanded worship, laid down the moral law, and were constantly getting tangled up in human affairs.
But then, a massive shift happened with the rise of monotheism. Suddenly, all those gods were replaced by a single, all-powerful God. In traditions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, this one God is seen as the creator of everything, the ultimate source of right and wrong, and a being who is deeply and directly involved in the whole story of humanity.
Now, let's move to our next stop, around the 5th century BCE, mainly over in the East. A totally different way of thinking started to bubble up. It didn't try to replace the old gods. Instead, it offered a path that, well, didn't really need them at all.
And this was a game changer. I mean, a truly revolutionary idea. The thought that you could live a spiritual, ethical, and meaningful life without centering everything on a creator God, that was a huge departure from the worldview that had dominated for thousands of years.
Buddhism is the perfect example of this. The Buddha lived in a world filled with gods, but his teachings basically made them irrelevant. He said that liberation from suffering doesn't come from divine help. It comes from understanding reality and following a practical path. And what's wild is that in Buddhist texts, gods might exist, but they aren't the creators. In fact, they're stuck in the same cycle of suffering and rebirth as everybody else. Around that same time in China, Taoism showed up with its central idea, the Tao, or the way. But here's the absolute key. The Tao is not a god. It doesn't have a personality or a will, and it's not giving out orders. It's just the natural, underlying flow of the entire universe. So the goal in Taoism isn't to please some deity. It's to get in sync with this natural order. It's all about simplicity and this principle of wu wei, which is kind of like effortless action. Think of a rafter using the river's current instead of fighting against it. So just like Buddhism, Taoism is really a philosophy about how to live, not what to believe about creation.
Okay, let's take a huge leap forward in time. We're landing in 17th and 18th century Europe. The scientific revolution is in full swing, and brilliant thinkers are trying to square this new world of reason and natural law with their traditional religious beliefs.
And out of this tension, deism was born. Deism holds on to the idea of a creator God, but completely reimagines what God's role is. You could say it was a philosophy for the age of science, an attempt to build a bridge between faith and reason. The whole essence of deism is what it accepted and what it rejected. Deists were totally on board with a creator God and with the power of human reason, but they rejected miracles, divine revelations, and any kind of direct intervention from God. For them, God's genius wasn't in supernatural events, it was in the elegant, unbreakable laws of nature.
The famous watchmaker analogy sums this up perfectly. Step 1. God, the master craftsman, designs and builds this incredibly intricate universe, like a watch. Step 2, he winds it up and sets it in motion. And step 3, he steps back and just lets it run according to the perfect natural laws he created. No more tinkering needed.
All right, today we're going to tackle one of the biggest questions there is. And get this, we're going to do it with a scientific concept that is so powerful, it could totally change how you see, well, everything. I mean, you've probably done this yourself, right? You look around at the world, all of its insane complexity and beauty, from a tiny cell to a whole galaxy, and you just have to ask, how? How did any of this come to be? So when you ask that question, you usually land on one of two big ideas. Was it all designed, by some kind of intelligent creator who put all the pieces in place? Or did it all just emerge? That's the other idea, this concept of emergence, where complexity can literally build itself from the ground up. Okay, so to even begin to understand how a universe could build itself, we have to get our heads around this incredible idea of emergence. And don't worry, it's not as abstract as it sounds. It actually starts with something you've probably seen a million times. Let's talk about an ant colony. You take one single ant, and honestly, it's not that smart. It's just following these super simple, almost robotic rules. But when you get a whole colony together, suddenly you have this hive mind that's incredibly intelligent. The colony finds food, it defends the nest, it coordinates all these tasks, it even manages its own population. So how does it do it? There's no ant queen giving orders. It's all done through simple chemical signals called pheromones. The colony's intelligence literally emerges from all those simple interactions between thousands of individual, not-so-smart ants. Okay, here's one of the coolest examples of emergence out there. It's called Conway's Game of Life. Now, it's not really a game you play, it's more of a simulation, and it runs on just 4 super simple rules. All they do is decide if a little cell on a grid lives or dies based on how many neighbors it has. So, you'd think 4 simple rules, that's just going to be a mess, right? Total chaos. But no, what you actually get is, it's absolutely breathtaking. You get these complex structures. Some of them are stable, some of them move and pulse. You even get these things that look like creatures that travel across the grid, multiplying and building other structures. And the mind-blowing part, nobody programmed them to do that. All of that complex, almost lifelike behavior just emerges from those 4 simple rules. So that's what we're talking about. That's the core idea. Emergence is what happens when simple parts, following simple rules, interact with each other and create something totally new, something with complex behaviors that go way beyond what any of the individual parts could do on their own. I love this quote. It really gets to the heart of it. 2 plus 2 no longer equals 4. It becomes more than 4. It's like this kind of creative math, where the whole thing becomes something much more than just its pieces. Think about it, right? A single H2O molecule isn't wet, but put a whole bunch of them together, and suddenly you have water. All right, so if this works for ants and computer simulations, how far does this idea really go? Well, it turns out it might be the key organizing principle for pretty much everything, the entire universe. Just think of the history of the universe as a kind of ladder of emergence. On the very bottom rung, you have simple little quarks following their rules to form stable protons. Then, those protons and electrons follow their rules to form atoms. And boom, a brand new property emerges. These new things can interact with light. Then, atoms get together to form molecules. Suddenly, 2 gases, hydrogen and oxygen, can create liquid water. Keep climbing, and molecules form cells, and an incredible new property emerges, reproduction. And at the very top of that ladder, those cells form conscious beings, like us. And that leads us to maybe the most mind-bending example of all, our own consciousness. The theory is that your thoughts, your feelings, your whole sense of being you is an emergent property. I mean, think about it. No single neuron in your brain is conscious, not one. But you wire them all together in this incredibly complex network, and somehow, out of that, awareness emerges. And just how complex are we talking? Well, the number of neural connections in your brain is around 860 trillion. To put that in perspective, that's thousands of times more connections than there are stars in our entire galaxy. It's just a staggering number. And out of that complexity, you emerge. But guess what? The ladder doesn't stop there with just one person. This same exact principle scales up yet again, and it shapes the unbelievably complex dance of entire groups.
including our own human societies.
You've seen this, right? A flock of birds or a school of fish moving like it's one single flowing organism. You have to wonder, how do they do that? Is there a leader? Nope, it's pure emergence. It turns out each bird is just following 3 incredibly simple rules, all based on the birds right next to it. That's all there is to it.
And this is such a perfect example of how our brains can get totally fooled by this stuff. The pattern is so perfect, so elegant, that our minds just jump to a complicated explanation. I mean, seriously, some scientists actually thought it might be some form of telepathy. But the real answer is just so much simpler, and in a way, more beautiful.
Okay, now this is where it gets really wild. What if we apply this same thinking to us, to human crowds? Well, scientists did, and they found that our behavior is bizarrely similar to, get this, gas molecules. We both try to keep our personal space and not bump into each other. And what's the result? When things get crowded, we spontaneously form lines and traffic jams, which is exactly what gas molecules do when they condense into liquids and solids. It's the same pattern.
And once you see it, you start seeing this emergent social order everywhere. Think about people naturally forming lanes on a crowded sidewalk. Nobody tells them to. Or the complex patterns of traffic flow. Or how a whole city grows and breathes almost like a living thing. Even that famous idea of the invisible hand in economics. That's just emergence bubbling up from millions of individual people making simple choices about what to buy and sell.
So, okay, this brings us full circle, right back to that huge question we started with. We've just seen how emergence can explain all this mind-blowing complexity, everything from life itself to our own consciousness. So, what does that mean for the whole idea of a designer or a creator?
Well, what emergence gives us is this incredibly powerful way to see how the universe could build itself piece by piece without needing a designer pulling the strings at every single step. But it leaves one gigantic question on the table. Where did the initial rules come from? You know, the fundamental laws of physics that got the whole game started.
And this is where the road forks into 2 really interesting philosophical paths. On one hand, you have the atheistic view, which would say that the laws themselves also emerged spontaneously. We just don't understand how yet. On the other hand, you have the deistic view. This one suggests that maybe an intelligent creator set up those initial rules, the basic physics of the universe, right at the very beginning, and then just let it go, letting everything else unfold on its own through this process of emergence.
In this idea, deism, it's actually not new at all. It was a huge idea back during the scientific revolution. You had these brilliant minds like Isaac Newton, Voltaire, Thomas Jefferson, and as they were discovering these beautiful, elegant laws of nature, they kind of pictured a clockmaker god, someone who built this incredible, intricate clockwork universe, wound it up, and then just let it tick on its own.
So here's the real takeaway. The concept of emergence doesn't really prove or disprove the existence of a creator. That's not what it does. What it does do is give us this absolutely stunning scientific framework for understanding how you can get from the incredible simplicity of the Big Bang to the staggering complexity we see today, life, consciousness, the whole shebang, all without needing constant direct intervention.
And so, we're left with the deepest mystery of all, aren't we? Emergence gives us a powerful explanation for the how, but it doesn't touch the why. If our entire reality, if you and I, if everything is the result of a set of simple rules playing out over billions of years, the ultimate question is still just hanging there. Where did those rules come from in the first place?
Okay, let's move on to our final concept, one that really gained traction in the modern era. This worldview takes the deist idea of rejecting divine intervention and pushes it one step further, asking, do we even need a creator in the first place?
And that brings us to atheism. Put simply, atheism is the rejection of theism. This can mean either just a passive lack of belief in any gods, or it can be an active, positive belief that no gods exist.
Now, it's super important not to confuse atheism with the non-theism we talked about earlier. Remember, non-theism basically says the God question isn't really relevant to solving our problems. It just walks a different path. Atheism, on the other hand, confronts the question head-on and concludes the answer is no. That's a critical difference.
Now, while you could find atheistic ideas way back in ancient times, they were always on the fringe. Atheism only became a really widespread worldview in the modern era, and this was fueled by huge scientific discoveries, like Darwin's theory of evolution, which offered natural explanations for things that were once credited to God. Plus, you had some very sharp critiques from really influential philosophers.
The core arguments for modern atheism usually stand on 3 main pillars. First, that science can explain the universe without needing a divine creator. Second, that morality doesn't require religion. It can be based on things like reason and empathy. And third, that life's meaning isn't something that's given to us, it's something we create ourselves.
And so, what does it actually mean? Today we're going to dive into this idea, one that's, believe it or not, as old as belief itself, but is still so widely misunderstood. So, you've probably heard this famous quote from the 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. It sounds kind of triumphant, doesn't it? A big declaration. But here's the thing that's really interesting. For Nietzsche, this wasn't a celebration. Not at all. It was an alarm bell. He was genuinely worried that without God as a sort of moral compass, European society could literally just fall apart. And, that gets you thinking about this really fascinating question that's going to guide our whole explainer today. If atheism offers a way to see the world, a way to make sense of life, could it, in its own way, actually be a religion?
To even begin to answer that, we have to go back and figure out where the word atheist even came from. And as it turns out, its origin story is, well, it started its life as a weapon. Okay, so the root of the word, it's actually pretty simple. It comes from the Greek atheos, which just means without a god. That's pretty much the definition we still use today, right? A lack of belief in a higher power. But how that word was used, well, that has changed dramatically over time.
If you go back to the 1600s, during the Protestant Reformation, calling someone an atheist was a serious insult. I mean, old dictionaries literally called it a damnable doctrine. But then, fast forward to the 1700s, and you've got Enlightenment thinkers who start making non-belief a more visible, debatable idea. And by the 1800s, folks like Nietzsche and Darwin helped turn atheism into a serious philosophical stance you could actually defend.
Even some of the U.S. founders weren't religious in the way we might think. A lot of them were deists. Their whole idea was that God created the universe, kind of wound it up like a perfect watch, and then just stepped back and let it run on its own. It's done.
And you can really see this shift in these two just fantastic stories. You have Thomas Jefferson, who literally took a pair of scissors to his own Bible and cut out all the supernatural parts, just to focus on the moral teachings. And then you have Thomas Huxley, a buddy of Darwin's, who got into a huge debate with a bishop and famously snapped back that he'd rather be descended from an ape than a man who uses his brain to hide the truth. Ouch.
So that growing confidence, right? From Jefferson's quiet edits to Huxley's very public arguments, it really opened the door for a much wider range of views. Because even today, non-believer isn't just one thing. There's a whole spectrum of unbelief.
All right, let's clear something up that trips a lot of people up. Atheist versus agnostic. What is the difference? Well, think of it this way. An atheist is making a positive claim. I do not believe in a God. An agnostic, on the other hand, is all about knowledge. They say, I don't know, and often add that the answer might just be unknowable. So one is a belief statement, the other is a knowledge statement.
And we're not talking about some tiny fringe group here. Not at all. In fact, it's one of the fastest growing demographics out there. Today, about 28% of Americans identify as religiously unaffiliated. This group, sometimes called the knowns, includes atheists, agnostics, and just people who don't belong to any organized religion. That's a huge cultural shift.
And it gets even more nuanced. Inside atheism itself, you've got different flavors. You have materialists who think physical matter is the only thing that's real. Then you have explicit atheists. They're the ones actively saying, nope, no gods exist. Compare that to implicit atheists, who might not have thought about it much, but just live their lives without any belief in a god. The big takeaway here is that non-believer is not a monolith, not even close. Okay, so faced with all this uncertainty, back in the 17th century, this philosopher Blaise Pascal came up with a really famous argument for believing. It's known as Pascal's wager. His whole argument boiled down to this one simple question. If you can't know for sure whether God exists or not, isn't it just a safer bet to believe? He turned faith into a question of risk management. So here's how Pascal broke it down, like a cost-benefit analysis. Look, if you believe in God and he turns out to exist, your payoff is infinite. We're talking heaven. If you believe and he doesn't exist, well, you've lost very little. But if you don't believe and God does exist, your loss is infinite. Hello, hell. So for Pascal, with infinity on the table, belief was the only logical bet.
But, as you can imagine, people have poked a few holes in this idea over the years. The biggest one is, okay, so which god am I supposed to bet on? There are thousands of them. Another big problem is, can you really choose to believe something just because it might benefit you? Is that real belief? And finally, is living a religious life really a small loss? For a lot of people, that involves huge commitments of time, money, and personal freedom. Which brings us all the way back to our big question. After all this history, all this philosophy, can we really look at atheism and call it a religion? All right, to really get to the bottom of this, let's do a little check-in. Let's take some of the common features of religion and see if atheism checks the boxes.
First up, does it have a moral framework? Well, for some, especially the so-called new atheists, critiquing religion is a central moral mission. So let's give that a partial check. Okay, how about shared gatherings, church-like events? There are some groups, sure, but they aren't a big part of most atheist lives. So that's mostly a no. And what about shared beliefs? Well, besides the whole no God thing, there's no single rulebook or doctrine, so it doesn't really fit there either.
So what's the bottom line? Well, it all comes down to how you define religion. It really does. If you think a religion is just a framework for thinking about big moral questions, then yeah, for some people, atheism could fit. But if you see religion as being about connecting to something non-physical or supernatural, then atheism is pretty much the exact opposite of that.
But, maybe we're focusing on the wrong thing here. At its core, doubt is the foundation of atheism. But doubt is also something every single one of us feels, about ourselves, about others, about the world. It might be one of the most universal human experiences there is, something that actually connects believers and non-believers.
And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. Maybe the real opposite of faith isn't doubt. Maybe it's certainty.
And so, we've come full circle. We've seen how our answers have evolved, from seeing gods in every thunderstorm to picturing a distant cosmic watchmaker, all the way to finding meaning in a universe with no gods at all. It's a powerful story of our relentless, ongoing search for understanding.
But of course, this story is far from over. This conversation continues with every single generation. As science keeps pushing into new frontiers and our societies keep changing, you just have to wonder, what new ideas are going to pop up? What's the next chapter going to be in this grand human quest for answers? Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this journey.